Hi everyone, it's Bryony. Welcome back to my channel. So today we're going to be talking about my pelvic floor. Changes to your pelvic floor after having a baby, I think, is something that a lot of people who give birth worry about. So now that I'm 8 months postpartum, I thought this would be the perfect time to give you guys an update on my pelvic floor and what my journey has been like. So in this video, I'm going to cover what my pelvic floor was like before and during pregnancy, what my worries were for my pelvic floor after giving birth, what my pelvic floor actually was like after giving birth, my experience of seeing a pelvic floor physiotherapist, and where my pelvic floor is today and any signs and symptoms I may still be having. I'm also filming this on a day where the sun seems to be playing peekaboo with the clouds, so you'll have to apologize if the lighting keeps changing throughout this video. Not a lot I can do about it, I'm afraid. So let's start with my pelvic floor before and during pregnancy. So I would say before I had a baby that my pelvic floor was pretty strong. I was a competitive dancer for 15 years from the age of 5 to 20, and I'd say that my core was one of my strongest parts of my body. With dancers, you always have areas that you're kind of stronger with and weaker with and more flexible with and less flexible with. And for me, my core strength was one of the things I think that I would say was one of my strengths. I certainly never had any issues with leaking or when I coughed or sneezed with leaking a little bit. I also found that it was quite easy to go on a trampoline or do activities and stuff. I never had to worry about any kind of pain or discomfort or leaking when it came to my pelvic floor before I got pregnant. I have, however, had an issue with painful urination for many, many years. I was 10 when it started. They've never quite figured out what it was. I've been tested for cystitis, interstitial cystitis, whatever it is. Every type of cystitis there is, basically, and several other things over the years for it. They've never figured it out. We thought it was eczema, but I'm now starting to think it might actually be a hormonal thing because it happened at age 10, and although I didn't get my periods until I was 14, there are kind of puberty shifts that start before that, and after speaking to a hormonal specialist gynecologist, I realised actually this could have been a symptom of estrogen and estrogen levels changing for me, because there are times of the month where it can be worse and times where it can be less worse when I had my periods, although I'm now currently on the pill to stop them. But that was a really strong burning pain when I actually urinated. It wasn't anything to do with I wouldn't say it was an issue with my pelvic floor as such. I even had surgery to try and widen my urethra in case it was the inside of my urethra was slipping down or something. Something like that, my urologist said, but it didn't help, unfortunately. So that was a bit annoying. But other than that, I had no other issues with my pelvic floor before I got pregnant. Now, when I was actually pregnant, I also didn't really notice many changes to my pelvic floor at that point either, even when I was quite heavily pregnant. I did have the occasional bit of leakage when I would cough or sneeze. I don't think I had it when I laughed, but I do remember coughing a couple of times, and that would trigger a little bit of dribbling. But other than that, I didn't have anything else. And although I needed to pee quite a lot towards the end of my pregnancy, which is very common, I had pressure on my bladder, I didn't have any pain in my pelvis or anything like that. I actually carried the baby quite well. I had horrific issues with palpitations and fainting constantly throughout my pregnancy, but actually in terms how I felt physically, I did quite well, I think, with pregnancy. And I also didn't get particularly big. I was quite small, and again, I think my dancing might have contributed to this, because even though I'm only 5'2", I was still I carried quite small as well, and it made it easier when I was out and about for people to not constantly touch my bump or anything. I didn't have any experience of that, so I was quite pleased that I was able to kind of disguise it a bit when I went out and about, particularly because I was heavily pregnant during the winter, and so that made covering out with a big coat even easier. But yeah, in my pregnancy, I had a really good time with my pelvic floor. My pelvic floor didn't play up at all, which honestly, thank God, because I could not have added anything else to my plate at that point in time. Next, I want to talk about what my worries were for my pelvic floor after giving birth. Now, it's important for me to say here that I actually suffered some pretty severe mental health challenges during my pregnancy. I was under a mental health team and everything, and my brain would take a small tiny issue and blow it up 100 times worse than it actually was. It was a really awful experience, and fortunately something that hasn't continued for me after I gave birth, but while I was pregnant it was a big issue for me. So some of these issues, they might sound inconsequential to you, but to me at the time they were massive things that gave me incredible stress and made me really, really depressed. The biggest thing that I was worried about in terms of my pelvic floor after giving birth was being incontinent to any level. I think this is because I was so terrified that if I gave birth vaginally, I might tear. I might have really bad stinging pain when I weed again, and it might potentially make the problem that I already had worse because, like I said, we never really figured out what it was. I have times where it's better, times where it's worse. I've seen all sorts of doctors under the sun, been tested for all sorts of things, but I was so scared that that was going to get worse, and I was also scared about having either urinary or fetal incontinence. And this worry was another one of the reasons why I ended up opting for an elective C-section. My birth option midwife, who I spoke to about these worries and other concerns I was having at the time about giving birth, sent me a really useful fact sheet from the National Health Institute, where they basically compared cesarean births with vaginal births, which was basically like a fact sheet which kind of talked about the pros and cons of having a C-section versus a vaginal birth. It was completely emotionless. It was just based on facts, and it was something really helpful to me, actually. And in particular, it was helpful for me in making the decision to have a C-section because it showed that the risk of having fetal or urinary incontinence after a C-section was lower than having a vaginal birth, particularly lower than having an assisted vaginal birth. So if you have like Von-2s or forceps, then the risk is much lower with a C-section than with a vaginal birth. It's not quite as different when it comes to an unassisted vaginal birth, but I did find that paper really helpful for me in terms of coming to the decision that I felt that a C-section was right for me, which it was, and I've done a separate video talking about my positive C-section experience if you want to go and see that separately. Now, there are obviously other things that are higher risk with a C-section birth than a vaginal birth, but they weren't things that my brain was obsessing on at the time, and so for me, I had to make a decision on what I felt would make me feel safer at the time, and so that's how I came to the decision about a C-section. And so that leads me on nicely to talking about what my pelvic floor was actually like after I gave birth. So because I had a planned gentle cesarean section, I didn't go into labour, and so I didn't experience any sort of contractions or anything like that. It is important to note that there is a slight difference between outcomes for people who've had planned C-sections versus those who have emergency C-sections who have already been through labour and potentially also pushing as well, or maybe not quite got to that stage, but you have gone through a significant period of time of having contractions and baby being kind of pushed down. I didn't have that, so this is purely from my perspective as someone who had and planned C-section. So when you have a C-section, they give you a spinal block to basically make you completely numb from the waist down for obvious reasons. They are cutting your stomach open. But when they do that, they also have to insert a catheter. Now, my catheter ended up staying in a bit longer than normal. They typically, so I had surgery at 11 o'clock in the morning, and normally I think they would want to try and get you up and out of bed by about 6 o'clock that evening. However, I was still numb to some extent until 6 o'clock the next day in the evening. So I definitely was not up and about that same day. I chose to take it easy and to rest and listen to my body, and it was definitely the right thing for me. But it did mean that I had my catheter in for 2 days in total. And at first, like, I couldn't feel it at all, and it was the best thing ever because I didn't ever have to get up out of bed to go pee. It just drained into this bag, and I was like, wow, this is actually really good. Once the anaesthetic had completely worn off me though, however, I could feel it kind of sitting inside me, and it was a little bit uncomfortable, and so I was quite pleased when they did take it out at that point. And one thing they warn you about when you have a catheter removed is it can take a bit of time for you to be able to sense when you need to go to the toilet or not. And it's also a bit tricky after you've had a C-section to actually pee. Like, engaging the muscles takes conscious thought. You have to like really focus on, I need to do this and this and this, and there we go. Top tip, by the way, if you are having a C-section, tilt your pelvis forwards. If you lean forwards, you seem to automatically engage those muscles and you go much easier. So top tip from someone who's been through it. There was, however, no stinging pain at all for me with that first pee I did after having my catheter taken out, which I was a little bit concerned about. I had heard some people say it stung a bit afterwards, but that was not the case for me. Hallelujah. And I'd say that the kind of needing to really consciously think about when I wanted to go pee only took 2 weeks for my body to kind of get back to normal with. After that time, it was much easier. It was kind of like going to pee like normal before I'd given birth again. There was a period, however, where I couldn't feel whether my bladder was full or not. So you had to kind of like really remind yourself, okay, it's been 4 hours since I've gone to the toilet. I probably need to go again. But from about 2 weeks after I had my C-section, when I started to be able to kind of recognize when my bladder was full again, started to be able to go to the toilet much more easily again, like not having to, as I say, consciously think about it. It wasn't painful, by the way. It was just kind of like a weird sensation of having to figure out how to go. But once I got to the point where that was no longer an issue, my pelvic floor, to be honest, felt pretty much back to normal. I never experienced a need to kind of go to the toilet more urgently, which is something that can commonly happen. I also never had any episodes of incontinence where I wet myself. Again, this is very common, whether you have a C-section or vaginal birth, to have something like that happen after you've given birth, particularly in the early days after you've given birth. But again, that didn't happen to me. I'd say by the time I got to around 6 weeks postpartum, which is when you have like your 6 or 8 week, as I had in the end, checkup, I felt pretty much back to normal within myself. Not completely like the rest of my body, I was still bigger and, you know, other things like that, and I was breastfeeding, etc. But in terms of my pelvic floor, I felt pretty good by around 6 weeks. However, I decided that it would be a good idea to go and have a pelvic floor physiotherapist just check me over once when I was around 5 months postpartum, because as someone who's had various different health issues in the past, investing in my own health and well-being is something I've learned is very important and is something that is always worth doing. So I thought, you know what, it's probably a good idea just to have a check over. So I ended up having something called a mummy MOT, which kind of does what it says on the tin. That name is a bit funny and also gag worthy at the same time, but it's a good explanation, I think. It is basically just a complete check over once you've given birth to see how everything's doing. If you're having any issues, you can raise it with the pelvic floor physiotherapist and she or he can give you some great tips. So like I said, I had mine done when I was around 5 months postpartum. What it basically involved was I went to meet this lady. Luckily she was quite local to me. And the first part of the session was basically me sitting down and her going through quite a long form, asking lots of questions about, like, was I incontinent? How did I give birth? Did I tear if I had a vaginal birth? Was I having urinary incontinence? Was I having fetal incontinence? Was I having any pain or any bulging? Lots and lots of questions like that. Like I said before, I was actually feeling pretty good. It was more I just wanted to check over, so that's what I told her. And she was like, yeah, great, that's fine. And then she did some tests with me standing up. She kind of had a look at my posture, how I was standing from all angles, and then I also lay on the table and she had a feel of my stomach, basically like they press down between the muscles that separate when you get pregnant. So she had a feel of my stomach, and there was one point kind of right by my belly button where she said that my muscle, when she pressed on it, like, and I was tensing my muscles, she could still like push in quite a way, which was interesting. So that's the only point where I had any kind of separation, and it was quite small. I think she said it was only like a centimetre or something for me. And so because of that, she gave me some very specific exercises to do to help that, and also some tips for if I was lifting anything heavy or bending down and stretching, etc. In particular, she gave me a tip to do something called blow before you go, which is basically where you blow out, and as you do that you pull in your stomach muscles and then you squat down to lift something up or bend down, etc. So kind of engaging your muscles before you do it. And I have to admit, I'm not as good at doing the exercises as I probably should be that she taught me, but I do try and do them when I remember. The other thing that this appointment involved was an internal exam. So this is where they she obviously put on a glove, she used some lubricant, and she did ask me if I was okay with her doing this, which I was. You can opt out of this if you want, but I would recommend having it done because it's how they get like a full picture of everything that's going on down there. And she basically, so she inserted her fingers into my vagina and kind of felt around all the edges, asked me to contract my muscles and squeeze them, etc. And she kind of pressed on each side as she did this, I think, just to see like how strong my muscles were, and also asked me to hold my muscle, to tighten my muscles and hold them. And that was quite interesting because I noticed at one point that I couldn't hold them quite as long as I thought I could. So she gave me some tips on how to kind of like work on doing that too. By the way, that was by far the least invasive thing I had in the whole process of trying to get pregnant, because I got pregnant via fertility treatment using an IUI. So if you've had any kind of fertility treatment, you had an internal scan or anything like that, trust me, this internal exam was nothing, absolutely nothing. And if you had a vaginal birth where they kind of checked your cervix was open, it's not painful in the slightest. Like, I barely felt her inside there, honestly. Like, trust me, it was absolutely fine. And the other thing that she did was, because I had a C-section, she had a little look at my scar to see how it was healing and gave me some tips for doing scar massage and also ways to treat it and things I could put on top. So for example, she recommended putting a silicone strip on top of it. That's apparently really good for scar healing. Have to admit, I didn't get around to getting one. My scar has felt okay, but I probably should have got one, and I might still get one. She pointed out that part of my scar had started to get raised, and that was just to do with the tissue buildup. So she gave me some tips for like breaking that down and for massaging around the scar too. And I do have to say, I do try and do those scar massages wherever I can, particularly now that Oren's getting bigger. Like, sometimes he's standing on me and he's like pulling like he presses on part of my skin and it kind of pulls on my scar, and I'm like, oh yeah, I should be doing my scar massages, and it does make a difference. So scar massage is something well worth doing if you do end up having a C-section. So that was probably one of the most helpful parts of the appointment for me too, because that's something that they don't tell you about when you have a C-section, which I think is a bit ridiculous. Like, they should tell you how to treat your scar ongoingly. And then she finished the session by basically giving me a list and writing down everything that had happened in the appointment and what she recommended I do, and the exercises, etc., the blow before you go that I talked about before, all of that stuff. So I found that really good and also quite reassuring for myself to know that I've been checked over by a pelvic floor therapist, and she was able to say that I was in pretty good shape. And that leads me on to where I am today. So my son is now 8 months old, so I'm 8 months postpartum, and I have to say my pelvic floor feels pretty good. I still haven't had any incidents of incontinence or a really sudden urge to go, although those things are pretty common. Like I said, in the early days, it didn't happen to me, and I think I was just very lucky with that. Generally, I feel like my pelvic floor is quite strong again, and I feel like I've pretty much almost gone back to how my body was pre-birth. The only exception to this, and the only symptom that I've noticed I still have now post-birth that I didn't have pre-pregnancy, is bloating. I am much more prone to bloating, and if I feel bloated, I tend to get more bloated as well. So I have kept my really comfortable maternity joggers that I had. They were by Seraphine, by the way, and they are just the comfiest things ever. If you struggle with bloating, or if you're pregnant and you want some really comfy joggers, I would highly recommend trying to get a pair of these. They were so great. I still wear them now. But I definitely noticed that if I'm bloated, I get a bit bigger than I did before. And I think that's because of, like I said, that little bit of muscle separation. Like my body is not quite as tight as it used to be. And so if I get bloated, it tends to like puff up a lot more. And I really do kind of tend to feel it. And I'd say I'm a little bit more sensitive to bloating now than I was previously as well. I don't remember being someone that got bloated very often prior to having a baby, but now I'd say it happens a little bit more often, particularly if I've had maybe some spicy food or something. As of right now, it's not really impacting my quality of life. I probably need to work on doing my stomach strengthening exercises a bit more, but otherwise, it doesn't really affect me too much. But other than that, I generally don't really notice anything. And so I think part of that was luck. I think part of it was also my age. I think being younger, I did perhaps bounce back. I hate that term, but you know what I mean, go back to how I was a little bit quicker and a little bit faster, healed a bit faster, I think, just because my muscles and everything are kind of used to still stretching and growing, etc. I also think having previously been a competitive dancer who did a lot of core strength work also helped, because my muscles have kind of been trained to be, I don't know, springy or something. And like I said, I didn't get too big in my pregnancy, so I think that was another thing that really helped me as well. So overall, in terms of my pelvic floor, I'd say I had a really positive experience when it came to pregnancy, birth and postpartum. And I really wanted to share that in this video, because I think we can often be, well, I certainly was terrified of things going wrong post-birth when it came to complications with postpartum, etc. And yes, that can absolutely happen. And if you do struggle in any way, for example with incontinence or pain or bulging, please do go and see your GP, because there are things that can be done to improve this, and you absolutely should not have to suffer through that. But not everyone is going to be in that position, and I thought it was important to share my experience as somebody who had a positive time with these changes, and that actually you might be okay. So if you're someone that was like me and worrying a lot in pregnancy, hopefully you found this video a bit reassuring. But let me know your thoughts in the comments, guys. How are your pelvic floors? Have you had a baby or not had a baby? Has something else affected your pelvic floor? Have you found that a particular exercise or sport that you do has made a difference? Be sure to let me know down below. And on the subject of comments, I have actually added something new to my channel, which is a membership scheme. You can become one of the Precious Stars Superstars for just $1.99 a month. This gives you access to some exclusive emojis, plus also I will respond to any questions that you put in the comments down below, and you get a special star by your name if you do. So if you'd like to be an extra special supporter of the channel, it's really appreciated. Like I said, I've done it at a very cheap rate of just £1.99 a month, and you get a few added extras thrown in too. If you want to know more about it, click on the join button down below and it'll show you the details of what you get for that membership. If you found any of my videos helpful and just want to leave a one-off tip, then you can also check out my coffee link, which is down below too. But as always, guys, thank you so much for watching. Do please subscribe, and I'll be back with another video next week. Bye everyone, have a great day.